want to introduce Colleen Thrasher from McGill University, and she's going to share the results of her inquiry into ecological economics. Thank you, Colleen.
So, I'm going to time myself actually. So let me know at any point throughout this if you can't hear me or if I'm speaking too quickly. That's just always a good thing to keep in mind for me. And good afternoon. So I will be talking about ecological economics. This is one of my favorite subjects, and it is also something that when I mention it, it often prompts people to say, but wait, what is that? So hopefully I will answer that question, but first I would just like to start with an exercise of the imagination. So for instance, we could say, imagine what the ideal world would look like. Think big. And I have just a few ideas, just a few. Obviously, I won't go through all of these, but a few include closing landfills, decreasing the world's garbage, closing income gaps, equal pay for equal work, increasing the access to affordable and available education, food, clean water. Things like this, they all sound great. But of course we don't have them, and that's why they seem so idealized. And there are many reasons why we don't have them, but one of the reasons in particular focused upon by ecological economics is that conceptual and professional isolation of the environment and economics have led to economic and environmental policies which are mutually destructive rather than reinforcing. And that destruction is evident under a whole host of circumstances related to the reasons why these things seem unattainable. So for instance, we see income gaps by the fact that fresh fruit and vegetables feel unaffordable for low-income brackets. That's where we see the intersection between the environment and the economy. So if the problem is isolation, ecological economics presents integration as the solution. Ecological economics is an integration between economics and the environment. It is an ecological approach to economics, and it is really summarized by this statement. Our economic system must be encompassed by and limited to the natural world that it exists within. And key ideas to keep in mind are interdependent, integrated, and interconnected. Robert Costanza is the founder of ecological economics, and he intended it to be a discipline that would reduce our ignorance of the real energy, environmental, and economic states of the world, and that through it we could develop better ideological and methodological options for understanding our world. So I thought that's what we'd do today. Number one, we would evaluate some problems, as in trying to reduce our ignorance about the real state of the world, and two, propose some solutions, as in develop better ways of understanding our worlds. And along the way, I thought we would have a few laughs. So I thought this was really funny as someone who studies economics. But also, I guess, is relevant, and I'd like people to keep it in mind. I will be showing a few graphs, and I don't want anyone to mistake me for implying causation when I'm definitely not. But the first thing I'd like to talk about is limits to growth. So what does our current economic system say about growth? I would like to read a quote from Robert Costanza, who summarizes it pretty well, I think. He says, current economic paradigms, capitalist, socialist, and various mixtures, are all based on the underlying assumption of continuing and unlimited economic growth. Most conventional economists define health in an economy as a stable and high rate of growth. Energy and resource limits to growth, according to these paradigms, will be eliminated as they arise by the clever development and deployment of new technology. And he refers to this line of thinking as technological optimism. However, I've also heard it referred to as modernization theory. These ideas are pervasive. They occur under many different titles and under many different thinkers throughout history. And we find them as early as Adam Smith, when he inquired into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He wrote, "It is not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continued increase, which raises wages." So what's the problem with this idea? And I'm going to do something that I was warned never to do as an economics student, which is critique Adam Smith, one of the founders of economics. and I'll critique him and others in 3 ways. So why isn't unlimited growth, or really the discourse of economic growth, a good thing? Well, number one, we aren't doing a good job of measuring it. And when our tools of measurement aren't good, our results generally aren't very good. 2, people don't seem to want it. And 3, it's not possible. So how do we measure economic growth? Well, GDP, gross domestic product, is the most widely accepted way. It's a measure of all economic activity within a region during a time frame. It's a pretty well-known concept. And it's separated into the categories of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. If there is a lot of economic activity generated in one of these categories, typically if there's a net positive overall, we experience an increase in GDP, and that is growth, and growth is good. Except it's not always good, because not all economic activity is a good thing. So one good example would be that the 1991 Exxon Valdez oil spill increased the GDP of Alaska. The Prince William Sound area was seen as more prosperous after the spill because people frequented the region to clean up the spill and ended up frequenting restaurants, hotels, etc. So that was seen as economic growth. However, it also led to the loss of 5 state parks, 4 state critical habitat areas, and only 2 of the 23 animal species in the region recovered. So it's astounding to me that that can be considered economic growth, because I don't really think it represents growth or development or progress. And in that way, ecological economists have been working on ways to better measure growth, to better measure progress, so that things like this can't be considered development, because they don't really represent genuine development. And they have titled it the Genuine Progress Indicator. Pretty straightforward. It has 26 indicators rather than 4, so it's a much more complicated measurement, but in making it much more complicated, it's much more honest. And those 26 indicators are separated into categories of economics, the environment, and society. So in our economic category, we'll find things like consumption expenditure, just like with GDP, but we'll also have things like the cost of unemployment. Under our environment category, we'll find things like the cost of pollution to air, water, and sound. That's where something like the Prince William Sound incident would fit in well. And under our social category, one of the categories I find the most interesting, we'll find things like the cost of crime and also the value of volunteer work. Volunteer work is an incredible thing, which sort of contributes a lot to our economy and our daily lives, but is not considered at all under GDP. And I think that well, I don't think I know actually that the GPI of Prince William Sound would not have increased, although GDP did. And I think that makes sense because economic activity generated from an oil spill doesn't really reflect genuine progress, and I don't think that that's a controversial statement. So why don't people seem to want it? Seem is the operative word here. I'm not implying some masterful causation theory. It's just what seems to be happening based on correlation. So US GDP has more than tripled since the 1950s. In 1960, we see a GDP of 543 billion. And in 2014, the most recent data, we see 17.7 trillion. Happiness, however, is a lot harder to measure, but that doesn't mean people haven't tried. So the National Opinion Research Council, based at the University of Chicago, has been asking this question every year since the 1950s. Taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you are very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? Can you also imagine getting that phone call and being asked to respond to that question? Pretty shocking. But what we see is that happy people, or the people who have registered themselves as very happy or pretty happy, didn't even double in the same time frame that GDP tripled. That's an unfortunate relationship. However, this doesn't really take into consideration the fact that the US population is increasing throughout this time. So these values are just looking at the absolute total number of people who have responded to each level of question. The US population is increasing throughout this time, which means that the proportion of people responding is getting increasingly small. What this means for the data has been studied further by Bill McKibben, more thoroughly than I really ever could. And he saw that when you actually took these values as a proportion of the US population, that there was a full 5% decrease in the number of people who counted themselves as very happy between 1970 and 1994, such that by 1994, less than a third of Americans counted themselves as very happy. Now again, I'm not making some gross claim that GDP is the absolute cause of unhappiness. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just pointing out that there is a correlation, or rather a lack of correlation, between increasing GDP and increasing happiness, as shown by my data. And the data that Bill McKibben studied actually showed a negative correlation. This brings me to my last argument, which is that it's not possible. So if those two other things didn't compel you, hopefully this will. And a good summarizer is what Paul Hawken says, which is that limits to prosperity are coming to be determined by scarcities of natural resources rather than industrial prowess. And what he means by this is that there are only so many resources on the earth. Technology cannot overcome biophysical laws. And that actually has become a really tense point of thought in economics for the last few years. So much so that the Scientific American published an article in 2009 titled, "Does Economics Violate the Laws of Physics?" And overwhelmingly the response was yes, which is concerning. In it, they talk about our energy return on investment, which is basically how much energy we get from how much energy we expend. And they specifically use the example of a squirrel. So this squirrel is eating acorns, and unfortunately, these are pretty tough acorns, so the squirrel actually uses more energy to eat the acorn than it gets from the acorn. And they say, if the squirrel continues along this pattern, it'll eventually die. And then they use that to parallel human behavior. So what's our acorn? Our acorn is oil. And in the 1930s, our energy return on investment was 100 to 1. So we got 100 barrels of oil per 1 barrel expended. In the 1990s, it was 36 to 1, so 36 barrels of oil per 1 barrel expended. And in 2006, it was 19 to 1. So we haven't reached 1 to 1 yet. I'm not about to sort of turn this presentation into a doomsday talk, but what it does mean is that we're getting increasingly inefficient in a very short period of time. And that's enough to cause chaos on its own as people sort of reel with the realization of that inefficiency. And what it also does is really bring to a point that question of, does the earth have the resources to sustain economic growth the way economists have often been showing in trajectories? Often we see 5-fold or 6-fold trajectories projected by economists. And if this is our resource path in the United States, I should mention these are United States values, not the world, then no, the world doesn't have the resources to sustain growth. And no, economic growth, the way that we have currently envisioned it, and the way our current paradigm envisions it, is not possible. But what else is there? Well, ecological economists propose that instead of a paradigm built on this idea of this sort of upward sloped diagonal line, we replace it with a circle. So a system based on cyclical flow, a system which is based on upcycling and recycling, cradle to cradle design, wherein the wastes of one industry are the inputs to another. And this all sounds very complicated, but the ways in which they do that is often just by focusing on services instead of goods. When we focus on the production of goods, we use more and more inputs to make those goods. And that's when we start demanding more and more energy, and that's when our energy return on investment gets increasingly small. It's sort of the difference between buying a new pair of shoes instead of going to a shoesmith. So we're sort of seeing the resurgence of shoesmiths, so to speak. And services are showing up in companies or in businesses that previously maybe people didn't think could be services before. A really good example would be that of Interface. So Interface is a carpeting company that provides the service of carpeting, not the good. So typically, carpeting is a good, and we lay down the carpet, and when it gets old and when it starts to fray, we tear it up, we throw it out, it goes to a landfill, or we downcycle it. But Interface provides you the service. So they own the carpet, and they lay it down in tiles, and when individual tiles fray, they take those tiles, repair them, and bring them back to you. And in doing that, they make a lot less carpet because they're repairing it so often. And they've actually managed to cut down on their resource use by about 80% in doing this, and have followed a successful business model. And I really like this example because it shows that we're not trying to develop technologies which overcome resource limitations. We're developing business models which recognize those resource limitations, and we're saying, well, how can we stop using up resources? We're working inside of biophysical limits, and that's what ecological economics is all about. It's an ecological approach to economics, it's an ecological approach to business. And I think I should mention, to conclude this part of the presentation, that this is a carpet ad. I don't know if that's totally evident. It's an interface carpet ad, and I don't really know what good a carpet ad asking what is human nature will do, but I'm kind of glad that they asked that, because it's also my question. So the second thing I'd like to talk about are mainstream economics' assumptions about human behavior. What is the economy assumed humans act like, and how is that reflected in our economic models? Really, there's three questions here. So what are the assumptions that economists are making? Are those assumptions accurate? And then what are the implications for the economy? And I'd like to start with this comic, which is, I think, pretty funny. But it makes me question, are we really like that? Is that really accurate? Is the opposite of a human better for the earth than a human? Because if that's the case, it's kind of depressing, and I don't like to think that that's true. But this is what economics says about humans. So it says that we are the Homo economicus, the economic species. And our behavior is calculated and it's utilitarian, and we use calculation and utility to fulfill our desires. We are self-interested, and we show that self-interested by increasing our ability to consume, by amassing wealth, and we have predetermined, consistent desires. Now, I can prove the last point wrong just based on what I choose to eat during the week for lunch. But don't take my word for it. Say that these are true. If these are true, then yes, I think that this comic is probably on point. I think we probably are just consumers, and if we are just consumers that are self-interested, and then the opposite of a human would be a socially interested provider, and yeah, a socially interested provider would probably be better for the planet. I agree. But are we really like that? And psychologists are increasingly saying no. So the first point of tension between psychologists and economists is about whether we're primarily emotional or primarily rational. And they think that we are very emotional, humans are very emotional, and that emotions are very relevant to our decision-making process, often in a non-rational way. After all, emotions aren't always rational. So that makes me think of Rachel Carson's The Sense of Wonder. For those unfamiliar, it's a short essay about how nature is this wondrous, magical thing, and we should cultivate an appreciation for it in youth and adults. And by cultivating that appreciation for it, we learn to yearn to protect it, and things like that. What I think about is wonder, how it's this really abstract concept. It's not really rational, it's not really calculated, and it's not very consistent. Our feelings of wonder, or what we find wondrous, change like the seasons. In fact, they change with the seasons, literally, as we find new things to find wonderful. And so I think that's why emotions often lie at the helm of environmental advocacy. Although there are plenty of rational arguments about why natural resources are valuable and important and we should protect them, arguments I will mention, I think sometimes you just want to say, like, look at that. Doesn't that look good? Why would you want to destroy it? And that might be a natural instinct. Psychologists are saying that we grasp emotional and visceral knowledge more quickly than we do rational. The well, look at that argument might target you more quickly than statistics or rationality even. And I think that that is an interesting point about human nature that really contradicts what the Homo economicus is all about. The second point of tension psychologists have with economists is how economists have envisioned our decision-making process. So this utilitarian calculation. They say, you know, pursuing something because it's desirable is not really the same thing as making a calculation about what will give you the most pleasure. Those two things aren't actually the same. One of those is instinctual, and obviously one of those is a calculation based on utilitarian principles. And we might be the instinctual one. So we might be emotional and visceral and instinctual in a way that the Homo economicus never could be. And if our current economic system is tailored to this, then it's not really tailored to us. And as those who have had clothes tailored improperly know, things tailored improperly often are uncomfortable, they don't fit well, and they sometimes chafe. So I propose that we have a case of economic chafing going on. Another way of understanding human nature would be biophilia, which I'd like to talk about before I dig into that economic chafing idea. So biophilia is what David Orr called the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. And it came from E.O. Wilson's idea that we are a biological species. That's actually not an idea, that's just a fact. But we are a biological species that will find little ultimate meaning apart from the remainder of life. And so David Orr extrapolated on this to say that we are bound to living things by what Wilson described as an innate urge to affiliate. And what this means for economics, David Orr also explains. He says, economics and economic principles, often based on growth, progress, and the bottom line, all demonstrate a contempt for things left unaltered. And I think what he meant by that is that we try to grow over and take over and turn into a lot of natural resources. We take natural resources and turn them into something our economy deems more valuable. And in doing so, we don't really leave a lot of the natural world left unaltered so that we can experience biophilia. So David Orr's argument is that within our current economic system, we actually suppress biophilia and thereby suppress human nature. Obviously, it stands to rely on David Orr's belief that this is human nature, granted. But that is this idea, and his solution is that if our natural world is important for us to experience human nature, then we have to limit our economy to nature so that we don't take over and we don't turn into things that we need to experience. And that again is this principle of ecological economics, which is limiting our economy to the natural world. And so before I mentioned limiting our economy to the natural world so that we don't overuse resources. And here I'm saying it so that we don't destroy human nature. It's a lot more, I guess, doomsday, this argument, but we'll move on. So the last point I'd like to mention is the way our economy values goods. And I'd like to open with a quote from Paul Hawken. So he says, we need to rethink our markets entirely, asking ourselves how it is that products which harm and destroy life can be sold more cheaply than those who don't. Markets, so extremely effective at setting prices, are not currently equipped to realize and recognize the true cost of producing goods. And I would argue that they're also not capable of recognizing the true cost of the goods that they degrade. This is because economics doesn't realize that behind all of the material goods we use regularly, there are a host of biological processes. Things like the water cycle, crop pollination, tectonic processes which put minerals into rocks that are necessary for those material goods to be used. So E.F. Schumacher actually took this idea and made a distinction between primary and secondary goods. Secondary goods are those goods produced by human labor, and primary goods are those given by nature and which are necessary for secondary goods to actually exist. And this is important because economics hasn't realized this distinction. It actually doesn't even realize primary goods exist. And according to conventional economics assumes these things got there by some materialistic equivalent of divine fiat, according to John CREA. And this idea is seen as early as David Ricardo, when he said, land retains its original indestructible economic value no matter what economic use is made out of it. Even farmers during David Ricardo's time could have informed him that he was not totally on point there, because of course, improper farming techniques will destroy topsoil, and it will take centuries to recover. And I think it just goes to show that David Ricardo, though his ideas on trade did massively influence both Britain and the US, maybe he'd never stepped foot on a farm. It's possible. So because economics doesn't really take into consideration these primary goods, or doesn't realize the value of these primary services, we often set ourselves up for policies of exploitation. When we don't realize the value of something, we can use up a lot of it. And that's something that the Manomet Research Institute in Maine actually took a look at. They have this really interesting passage from one of their research papers that I'd like to read to you. They said, without that dollar price, nature's benefits have historically been undervalued or deemed to be zero. The result of that approach isn't good. About 60% of the world's natural ecosystem benefits have been degraded or used unsustainably over the past 5 decades, a trend that is only likely to steepen unless new approaches are used. So what are ecological economists doing? Well, they're trying to put a value to those goods. They're trying to value them in a way that conventional economics never has. And an older study was done by Robert Costanza and some other economists. In the 90s, they tried to value all of Earth's natural resources, everything. And they did this by trying to calculate replacement costs for those interested. And what they came up with was a mid-range figure of about 3 times the GDP of all human activity on Earth. In other words, out of every dollar of value circulating the world's human economies, something like 75 cents were provided by resources, natural resources, rather than human labor. That's pretty significant. And even more recently, the Manomet Research Institute tried to do a similar valuation of Maine's natural resources. And what they found was that Maine's natural resources had a total value of approximately $14.6 billion. And there are some interesting details here as well. So for instance, urban wetlands and urban forests are more valuable per acre than their rural counterparts, likely because people interact with them more regularly. But this also means that because people interact with them more regularly, they're more at risk of degradation, and their degradation will be similarly more harmful. And I think these values are really important. In trying to put some kind of monetary value on these resources, it's a good step in making people aware of their necessity. It would be even better, though, if we could use these kinds of values to show that conservation of natural resources was even more profitable than rehabilitation of degraded resources. Funny that I mentioned that, because that's exactly what they did. So they actually did study this. In the Sebago watershed, they conducted a study wherein they tried to see how expensive would it be to put an infrastructure that would conserve and maintain water quality, and how expensive would it be to put an infrastructure after pollution that would treat the water to make it clean again and to make it usable again. They called it gray versus green. Green being the good one, the conservation one, and gray being the pollution treatment one. Pollution treatment is almost double the cost of green infrastructure. So what we can see here, and why these values are important, is that when we take into consideration things not previously considered in conventional economics, is that we can actually thrive economically in ways previously unconsidered. So we can thrive with clean water and healthy landscapes and clean air, and those things were never considered previously. And we can thrive numerically too if we take into consideration values never before considered. And so what I'd like to conclude with is just mention some of the efforts currently being done in Maine to protect water quality, And that would be the Volunteer Lake Monitoring Program, which is located in Auburn. And they have a completely volunteer training system where they train people to be volunteer lake monitors, and they monitor water quality and also invasive species. And I just thought it was pretty interesting and cool, so I put up their link, just some shameless advertising, I guess. And with that, we are back to the beginning, the way I like all systems to work. And it's just this thesis here, this definition of ecological economics, which is that our economic system must be encompassed by and limited to the natural world that it exists within. I hope this has been enjoyable, if not also educational. And I thank you all for watching and listening and taking the time out of your day. And I hope it's been a successful journey. Yeah.
It seems to be a peculiarity of capitalism that we don't make the connects that you first referred to. We privatize gains and socialize losses.
Right. Oh.
And that's I see that in the health field, and you're pointing out eloquently in the field of environmental ecology. What are the origins of that?
Of environmental ecology?
Of this disconnect?
Well, I mean, as I did mention, early thinkers in economics like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. I took a history of economics class this past year, and it's kind of funny because it's basically like we latched on to the first people who had a good idea. They did have a good idea. Adam Smith and Ricardo both had and said some really interesting things. And those things did provide a lot of profit for what they were good for. I don't know, and this has been suggested by other people, so like I don't know if Adam Smith could really see the world past what it was. You know, he was providing an economic doctrine for his time period, and he could never have predicted the world today. And that's typically why a lot of historical economists' predictions are just completely wrong, because there's no way of them knowing. But we really did latch onto these ideas because they were the first good ideas. And that's not always a bad thing, but I think in this case, it kind of resulted in some deleterious consequences. So that would be my suggestion. Just sort of sheep herding, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question for you. So I read portions of the Paul Hawken book, and I thought it was really interesting, and he made a good point. He made many good points, but one of the difficulties I had with the whole idea of that is who owns the natural resources? Is it the landowner? Is it the, air quality is everybody's air quality. So when is it a social, when is it everybody owning something, and when is it privatized, those natural resources? And how does one monetize? I can understand putting a value to it, but how, from the economy, from an economic standpoint, how does one actually bring that into the economy?
So
those natural resources.
So how do you
set a price on it? As a government, for instance, like Nestle at one time up here with Poland Spring was talked about taxing the water that they take from Maine because it's a natural resource.
Right.
But that was dispensed with. Who does that? What's the mechanism to do that?
Well, those studies that I mentioned, things like trying to put a value on those natural resources through replacement costs, I think that those are a good indication of, like, I would agree with setting a tax on water, on pulling water, because I think that those resources do have value. But of course, if we agree to that, then that means that we're like incorporating those resources into business, which is where your argument's coming from. So in that case, I mean, I do think there's a role for government. I do think there's a role for sort of the public service to keep in mind those values. I think that those values sort of should be integrated in all levels of government and all levels of business, so that when something like Nestle wants to take water, they get taxed for it. And so when businesses want to utilize natural resources, they have to pay for them. And so when a government has to also use natural resources, they have to pay for them. I sort of see these things as applicable at all levels of
So
society.
kind of like a value-added tax
Yes.
is to certain
Right.
produced items, you would do the same for natural products.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just to throw in my 2 cents, which also comes from Paul Hawken, when we look at, as Colleen was doing, the idea of exactly what an economy is for, what are the goods that we want as a society to get out of it, when compare that to what we tax, assuming that all taxes create a disincentive, we often tax the things that we want to get more of. We tax them, we tax work, we tax investment, and so Hawken and many of the ecological economists suggest let's tax the things we want less of. So let's base our tax system around pollution, resource extraction, and that's one way to get at that commons problem too. The things that we all own or all have an interest in collectively then become taxed.
Colleen, it's amazing to me that you were researching and getting this presentation together, because I know you were doing a million other things. And I think it would be interesting for the audience to hear also what activities you've been carrying on in connection with CREA.
Well, I've also been working with CREA, helping to run anything that they need help with. So I've been helping with all the school programs, all the school outreach, and all the camps. Well, actually, off and on the camps. Cameron and I switch off and on. I also helped set up a composting program. So we're starting composting at the Ecology Center. And I made 2 teaching tools for that to teach people about how to compost. I also wrote a founding story of CREA that we're going to use on the website, and for anyone who needs a more in-depth understanding of how CREA came to be. And I did that by interviewing Carla and John Wasilewski, and Dana Carey also contributed. What else did I do? Oh, I'm also writing pieces for the CREA newsletter, and I also made some games, like I came up with some games and teaching stuff for camp. I think that's it. Oh, and I also, I guess, was like manned tables at all the events we did. Like we did the Peace Fair, and I was there.
That's so great. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Colleen. So Eloise, are you all ready to pop in here?
I just need to.
Intern, and he's going to be giving us a presentation on solar electricity in Maine and progress, potential, and prospects in our community. Take it away, Cameron.
Well, thank you guys once again for coming today. We really appreciate your time and showing up. As Matt said, today we'll be covering a lot about solar electricity here in Maine. Especially with Colleen's presentation, I think we'll see some interesting overlaps between how we're valuing the solar energy that's possible here in our community. And for the most part, however, or at least in a lot of cases, we will see that a lot of these numbers that we're looking at are operating in mainstream economics to an extent. The main purpose for that, and we'll see that that's not always the case, is because this is what the policy is focusing on right now. So when we look at local, state, and national governments, these are some of the numbers that they're looking at when they're deciding how we should support solar energy and things like that. So we'll start with kind of an introduction and overview of what kind of solar electricity is used for, some of the basic technologies, looking at the state of Maine in terms of what other renewable sources we have and things like that. And then we'll get into actually a more focused in look at Highland Green's community, and we've completed a study to look at what the potential generation capacity of a place like Highland Green's is if you have rooftop systems at your house. So here's a quick map that I like. This is from U.S. Energy Information Administration profile. Energy information, you can't quite see it there. But this is basically a map of all the different renewable energy plants that are currently found in Maine. So we see a lot of, this is hydroelectricity along a lot of rivers and the coast. These are obviously solar turbines, and then we see these trees, which are wood biomass fuel sources that we have. One thing that's clearly missing from this graph, however, is solar electricity. And actually, this shading we have here over the state of Maine is actually our photovoltaic solar potential here in Maine. We can see we're kind of in this grayish area, this kind of tannish color. So we're on the lower end of the spectrum, but we can actually see that, and I think the official number is 4 to 4.5 kilowatt hours per day of PV. Solar potential, and PV is the abbreviation for photovoltaic, which is the most common electricity technology that we use in this case. So some general facts about Maine. In reference to that map that we just saw, 60% of Maine's net electricity comes from renewables. That's fantastic. If we take a look at where this kind of breaks down, we see that most of this is coming from hydroelectricity, wood biomass, and wind energy. And actually, I think there's a lot of talk of expanding wind energy production here in Maine, especially off coast, because there's a huge wind source here. But for our purposes today, we'll be focusing on solar electricity. And the reason for that is because given that graph where we see very little solar electricity on the plant scale, we actually get 33% more solar installation than Germany, which is, at least as far as 2012 goes, and I think since then, is one of the world's leaders in solar electricity. So we've got a big gap that we could easily fill up, I think. So this is kind of an overlook of where the solar industry is right now in Maine. In 2014, 3.5 megawatts was added to the nation. This megawatts is essentially 1,000 kilowatts, and kilowatt hours is the typical measurement that we use for measuring energy produced from electricity. And a total of 13 megawatts of solar energy is currently installed in Maine. And you can see that we're ranking fairly low overall in terms of national rankings compared to some of these other states. We'll take, so this is enough power to power around 2,380 homes. Pretty good, not great, we could do better, I think. Residential and commercial installation prices have been falling steadily since 2010, and you can see this in a number of areas. Most government agencies that collect statistics on these measures will show similar numbers. In other words, solar is getting a lot cheaper. And for our purposes today, I've chosen to focus on the residential option. I'll be talking a bit about some commercial projects that are possible and are going on right now, but residential is our focus for today. And here we see the top 5 states for residential PV. And if we remember that number of 13 megawatts of solar electricity, that's not stacking up too well against the top 5 states in the country. So we've talked a lot about what is already installed, what is the value of the solar electricity. And I think this is actually a nice tie into how we're valuing this resource that we have. Virtually limitless, since we're taking this from sunlight in many cases. So there was a recent valuation study done for the Maine legislature, and it was just earlier this year. This value put it at 33 cents a kilowatt hour, which is outstanding. And a number of things went into this number in this calculation. It was actually fairly comprehensive, I would say. The first year value for Central Maine Power customers is around 18 cents. And that's lower because mainly you're dealing with installation costs at these times. This is when everything's getting started up. And then over 25 years, that value rises to our 33 cent standard that we've looked at now. And there's a lot of things that went into this, obviously. The main categories were bill and energy supply. So this is looking at what the utilities have to do in terms of charging, track records and consumption, all of this, transmission, delivery, distribution. And I should say the difference between transmission and delivery in this case. Transmission is service operators taking the electricity from generation plants and transmitting it into our power lines and our infrastructure of electricity, and the distribution is then that infrastructure. And this is the big one, environmental value was also incorporated in this. This is including carbon offsets, carbon emission offsets, anything that would be avoided by the production of solar energy as opposed to from natural gas or oil in this case. And there was a few other smaller factors that included things like market responses. This is kind of where we're looking at the more mainstream economic basis. So this is obviously, or at least in some cases, a disputed value. The big dispute, of course, is the social benefits included. I believe the understanding I have is that essentially these aren't necessarily incorporated into customer decisions and purchasing. But obviously, as we've seen by the previous presentation, that these are important things that we do need to include and add a lot of value to the solar electricity that could be generated. The main utility concern from Central Maine Power is how this study valuation will be applied to policy. And this is mostly a concern when you look at, should this value encourage lots of people to adopt solar energy and installations? How does this transfer costs to customers who still can't afford panels, essentially? And this is actually a big debate currently in the United States over kind of rate structure. How do we charge customers appropriately and fairly? There's a lot of discussion on this end of things. But it's interesting to know that Central Maine Power doesn't actually have too much of a concern in terms of the supply side of the electricity market. They're mainly actually concerned with transmission and delivery concerns. So they actually have little interest in what competing generators might have input on. Increased costs of net metering. If lots of customers want to buy into these solar programs, there's a standard fee that goes into the net metering when you first purchase solar panel installation. And this is a concern how these costs might rise for, say, Central Maine Power or something like that. Shifts of costs to customers, as I mentioned, and integration and forecasting is another big issue, of course. When you have all of these kind of dispersed energy sources, how are these affecting what the utilities have to account for in terms of how they supply homes? This is also a big dispute and a big challenge that's being worked on. And the study may underestimate benefits from offsetting future infrastructure costs when you think about capacity of lines. So if lots of people are buying into these things, this means that either fewer or smaller size power lines essentially need to be installed. That's kind of the idea. And so for all of these reasons, obviously input factors are always tough to account for in a big dispute. So for our purposes, we use 33 cents per kilowatt hour as a benchmark for kind of where we can place the value of solar energy relative to the cost of producing it by solar electricity means. So quickly, I want to go over some of the technology basics of a photovoltaic rooftop system. This is going to be the basis for our study in Highland Greens. So this is the main technology behind what would be going into Highland Greens should we say put a solar panel system on every single house in Highland Greens. So the residential option, usually systems are 3 to 10 kilowatts in size. In most cases, you're covering around half or better of your consumption with a size from like around 4 to 5, and we'll see how that compares in a more detailed study. String inverters, this is the name of the technology, but essentially these are high efficiency inverters that allow the DC to AC conversion to be very good. That's the description of that. Net energy metering is used, as we've mentioned briefly. Central Maine Power is requiring all citizens, all residents who want to install these grid-tied systems to have this so that they can monitor the inflow of electricity and the outflow as well. And before financial incentives, we're looking at around $12,000 to $20,000 with installation costs. This is still obviously very high, but as we'll see, there are a few financial programs in place to bring down this cost. And usually cost recoupment, recovering these costs, recurs over 10 to 12 years. So net metering is essentially, again, what allows residents to more or less buy and sell electricity from, let's central Maine power for our purposes here in Maine. And net energy metering allows us to keep track of this and also credit customers properly, or at least ideally properly. So the grid and, yes, excess generation flows onto the grid and residents are credited accordingly. Any generation that occurs that is kind of below the consumption line feeds right into the household. It's anything surplus of that. And then you have around 12 months of a billing cycle to use those credits, or to use that excess generation, in other words, before it's essentially allocated to the utilities. And of course, the state requires all homes with grid-tied systems to track this flow, as we've mentioned already. This is kind of your basic setup of that with smart metering technology. You've got your panels that are feeding into your string inverter in the form of DC power. This is then inverted into AC. Your fuse box would then feed right into your home. Anything extra on top of that is exported and then imported if you're below that line. So this is just kind of a quick diagram of what a typical photovoltaic system would look like. The common technologies associated with photovoltaic systems are crystalline silicon cells. These are by far the most widely used in the solar industry today. These are 15 to 19% efficiency, and what we mean by that is essentially of all the available sunlight that is hitting these panels, 15 to 19% of that available light is being used for energy. This seems very low, I know, and actually the highest efficiencies are working between 20 and 25%, somewhere in there. So engineers are working on this tirelessly, I would say. The other option for technology is thin film cells. Now these are a lot thinner, more flexible. They do have a lot lower efficiency, but they're also a lot lower cost. And this is a very promising area of technology for research because they are so low cost in terms of how they're produced and how they're installed. So now that we have our technological basis established and kind of an overview of how Maine's oriented in the solar industry, let's look at what can happen at Highland Green. And essentially what we're going to be answering is, if you were to put a standard system on every single household that's currently constructed in the Highland Greens, how much could we produce? How would this look per household and things like that? So this is your standard map of Highland Greens. The older development is near here, near the community center, and then the newer follows the line, obviously. These two squares represent 2004, and what we're going to be looking at is the growth in solar technology over time here in Highland Greens. So these two squares are actually, both have hot water systems, and this one was the first to adopt photovoltaic. So in 2004, we have 2 houses with some form of solar electricity or solar energy technology. Fast forward to 2005, we had 3 more houses, all with only hot water technology. So we can see hot water, of course, is a little bit smaller of a system. It's a little more easy to install. It can be a little more practical in those aspects. For the focus of this presentation, we focus more on the electricity in the photovoltaic systems, but nevertheless, it's interesting to look at. Fast forward to 2008, we added 1 more house up in the newer side of the development. This is also a photovoltaic system, and this is where it gets interesting. 2014, we had 5 houses, all with photovoltaic systems and some hot water systems scattered in between that. So already from 2008 to 2014, we've seen huge growth. And then again in 2015, we had another 3 houses. So I think this offers us a good snapshot of kind of where the technology and where the cost of installing these things is headed. In other words, very promising. So some basic information on the Highlands. I've accounted for 175 buildings, and when I say 175 buildings, I really mean houses. And in addition to that is the community center and the Wild Duck Hub. 37 of which are angled such that they don't have great angles for solar generation. There's generally a window 30 degrees to the left and right of 180 degrees true south, 180 degrees being the most optimal angle for your roof. And anything outside of that starts to get less than optimal production. And 37 of these houses are probably situated the worst. But still, we can see out of these 175 buildings, Most of these houses are going to be well situated. And 17 of which have some kind of significant shade. A quick look at Google Earth will show that really most houses get a lot of sunlight throughout the day. And there's only a few, because we are kind of situated around a reserve, that have some shading factor. So what we're after in this brief estimation is the potential annual production of all households in Highland Green. So if we add up all the production taking course at Highland Greens over the course of a year, what does this look like? The fundamental variables that go into this are pitch, and that's actually the horizontal angle distance from horizontal of where your roof would be associated, and then where those panels would be relative to that. So that's kind of the angle relative to where the sun is. Roof orientation, as we mentioned, again, 180 degrees is most optimal, but we calculate this for all households. And shade. Shade and orientation are perhaps the biggest things, and shade is very difficult to account for when you're looking at a lot of houses. And the tool we use for this is made possible for the NREL here. This is PV watts, and this is actually what Revision recommends most people use, and I imagine most other installers would recommend as well. This will allow us to put all of these factors into a calculator, and out we get an annual production for a household. So because this is a fairly large-scale study, there are some assumptions we have to make, and PV Watts makes some assumptions as well in terms of how these would produce. So of course these aren't precise measurements, but they do give us a snapshot. Same geographic location, that's pretty self-evident when you look at our addresses. Changing an address from one to the other doesn't change too much in terms of what weather we're seeing. Residential fixed roof mount arrays. This is the type of model we're using. You can also have ground mounted panels, ones that track the sun as the day goes by. But for our purposes, we're going to assume we're putting a panel fixed to every roof household for the sake of space conservation, if you will. Standard module type at 16% efficiency. Some of the newer systems actually have much higher. But for the sake of cost and these other things, we're going to try to undershoot our annual production number so that we can actually see still how really good it is. So we chose the standard module type, and this is the language that PV Watts will use if you were to go into the calculator. 4 kilowatt system size is what I chose to go with in our estimation here. This is probably lower, I'll get to that in a second, but this is probably a bit lower than what would be needed to cover most of your consumption. But given roof surface area and things like this that you can do through PV Watts, this was a reasonable size to go with so that we could ensure that every rooftop could actually have a system on it. And 43-degree roof pitch, that's based on our latitude. So again, that's the horizontal angle there. This is kind of the default way to determine what that pitch would be. And for a large scale estimation like this, it's pretty reasonable. System losses are a huge factor in this. These are the assumptions we're making. We're assuming 4% annual loss. This is including snow. The good news is with a 43-degree pitch, you actually have a lot less loss from snow and things of accumulating because there's a lot more runoff, obviously. 2 to 4% for shading. This is how we've tried to account for shading in areas that may have it. This is not perfect. In fact, you really need a shade analysis tool that most installers will have to get an accurate reading on this. But we've done our best to account for it nonetheless. And the results through the PV Watts calculator is 14.96 overall. The other things that go into this are things like technology, misreadings, inverter things, minor technical deficiencies that would occur in any given system. And these are the default values that PV Watts gives. The cost assumptions we're making is 12 cents a kilowatt hour from the utility. This allows us to compare the energy value of the solar electricity produced to what might otherwise be produced by or supplied by the utility. And the initial cost of the installation is $3.30 per watt DC power. This is again mostly default values given by PV Watts. And they are reasonable considering our price range and our size of the system that we're installing. So the main variables are orientation, shade, and of course the pitch. But there are 3 exceptions. These are the 3 largest systems in Highland Greens, and residents have been very kind to show me what their systems are likely to produce. These were analyzed by Revision Energy, so they were able to give a much more accurate reading of what their annual production will likely be. So we've used those numbers in the cases of those 3 houses. So this is just a nice graph that shows, I think it looks nice, it's very neat, right? Between roof orientation and the annual production of a given household. Each dot represents a house in Highland Greens, and as we can see, this is kind of our optimal range between 150 and 210 degrees facing south. And you can see there's a good cluster of houses that are right in that range, and really only a handful of houses on the outer ranges of that. So let's get to the results here. Just to put this into context, in 2013, the Maine legislature calculated that 7,710 kilowatts per year were consumed by an average household. And to cover this, a 6.5 kilowatt PV system would be required. And again, we're looking at 4, so we already know that we're not going to quite probably meet our needs in terms of going completely off the grid, so these are retight systems. But nonetheless, we can see that where this is kind of stacking up relative to that. And in 2012, also note that $1,247 per person annually were spent on residential energy consumption. So like over the course of a year, your residential energy bill would be something in that range. These are important numbers when we look at the results, because that is the grand total number for Highland Greens. 767,277 kilowatts per year. And again, that's covering all 175 buildings here in Highland Greens. The total size is, of course, 175 times 4, so 700 kilowatt size installations. On average, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, a little over 4,300 kilowatt hours per year on a household are produced. And when we consider the 7,300 or so number that we saw from the Maine legislature, we're seeing we're covering well over half of our consumption. And the energy value associated with this was just under $500. And again, when we look at this number right here, again, we're seeing we're covering around half of that energy value. So a huge reduction in energy costs, really, from the solar potential. And the range of cost of electricity, again, this is interesting when we compare it to the valuation study that we covered. 16 cents to 21 cents a kilowatt hour per household. So we are well below that valuation mark, right? Especially when we consider the social benefits. And even not considering the social benefits, we might still be above that line. So we see that it's actually very advantageous at this time for an average household in this area even, maybe not even Highland Greens, to be adopting some kind of solar energy. For each household, on average, this works out to 12 kilowatt hours a day. And in the low production months, this is kind of your winter months. You're looking at around 9.9 kilowatt hours and 14.7 in your high production months. So there is some variation by month, obviously, because we get different sunlight in different months. But when we put this into context of what an average household consumes, we see that 12 kilowatt hours a day, and even just under 10 in the low production months, is covering most of these items here. Certainly you could cover your refrigerator, your flat screen TV, most of your lighting in your home. And there are obviously ways to reduce the energy draws from these items anyway by Energy Star appliances and things like that. So even if we're not covering all of it, most of the time it looks like the 4 kilowatt system is covering quite a bit. So in total, these are the environmental stats, 583 tons of carbon emissions from all of these panels are saved. And this is about 6,665 per household on average. So that's pretty incredible to me in itself. So we do have some limitations, of course, associated with this study because it was a bit more larger scale. The technology we use has been kind of uniformly applied. Most installers, especially Revision, will tell you that no one technology is a go-to. In fact, there's a lot of different considerations that go into what technology is chosen for a location. And especially as the technology rapidly develops, we're probably going to be looking at even maybe better technology than what we've accounted for here. Shade analysis, again, this is something that's difficult to account for given the resources present. And I would even say it could go either way. We could have more shade here in Highland Greens, we could have less shade depending on what we look at per household. House specifications in terms of roof, surface area, things like that are obviously very important, and we've kind of uniformly distributed it once again. Financial considerations are, of course, very important here. The cost from your utility bill, the electrical draw of your home will be different per household, and these are things we couldn't really account for in the study. So these are things to consider, but again, the overall goal of this study was to really kind of undershoot what was probably the case in terms of potential, to show that even when we're conservative in our measurements, the generation potential is still huge. And of course, as I said, the electrical load is another important consideration. So how does this fit into the state of Maine? Where are we at with this production and installation? There's a lot of things going on the national level. The 30% federal tax credit is still in place, essentially for residential homes. This decreases to 10% at the end of 2016. So time is running out on this end. In July's presidential address by President Obama, he's announced expansions of IRC as the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. They've been doing a lot of studies in the works of shared renewable energy, and this is kind of important when we consider lower and middle income families that might not be able to adopt their own installations. And of course, the rise of residential storage, this is slowly emerging. We're not quite there yet, but prices for batteries are falling. This will obviously smooth consumption, not only for the households, but make it easier for utilities to predict what households will be consuming. And plans elsewhere, particularly I think in San Diego, there are discounts in place to give residents who have battery storage. This allows the utilities to actually use some of that storage. So you can see utility companies are still looking for ways to smooth kind of what their forecasting is. Local developments, there's a few things going on, and by no means is this a total encapsulation of everything going on. These are just some highlights. Solarize Freeport has been very successful. Essentially, in Freeport, there was a program enacted, and I think it's more or less, the deadline has been reached, but for residents who sign into the program, through bulk pricing, there's a discount on everything, on all the installation materials that are bought, in somewhere in the realm of 10%. So this is notable, and actually Brunswick has been looking into their own program because the Freeport program has been so successful. Community solar farms tie in nicely to our discussion of community sharing of these resources. Shareholders are essentially credited with the production of a larger installation. So you have 8 or 9 people, I think there's one in Paris, Maine, it's 9, who buy into a larger array that's constructed, and at the end of each month, you're credited with your equal share of whatever's produced. Really interesting option, especially if you may not be able to afford your own solar array. And purchase power agreements are kind of fitting into our commercial discussion. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this area. Basically, you have 3 parties get together, one who takes care of maintenance and construction, the other kind of resident kind of owner, and then your utilities who all get together and work out an agreement for how a large installation can get installed. A good example of this is over at Bowdoin College. Something that's like this has just been done, where the college couldn't really take care of couldn't really benefit as much from federal incentives, but Solar City could, so the two got together, made an arrangement with the utility, and made something happen. So really cool stuff. Here's the big but in our discussion. This is a lot of where the gap is coming from. The state level is a bit lacking at the moment. As of now, there is no state subsidy program in place, although we have some rebates for Energy Star rated appliances, things that you can buy. But the valuation study is a step forward. So things are in the works. They're moving a bit slowly, but part of this is so that policymakers and regulators can have an idea of just what this value is, and how they can incorporate it into the discussion of rate structures and grid-tied systems in general. The Resolve bill is the one that recently did pass, and this is putting pressure on the Public Utilities Commission here in Maine to kind of, again, look at this true value of solar, incorporating these social benefits, all these things that could be avoided through solar electricity. And again, it's trying to more accurately credit residents, which is perhaps a bit off at the moment. So thank you guys so much. This is kind of the state of where generation is in Maine. A big thing is, of course, where this legislation will go. The state policy level would be huge in terms of getting things mobilized. In places where, like New York and Massachusetts, there are actually quite extensive, ambitious programs in place, and we're seeing the benefits of those. So I really think something in Maine could be suitable. So thank you guys so much for your time. We really appreciate the time to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Colleen.
How come some of the Highland Green houses have solar panels in the arrays and some don't? Is that a...
Yes, my understanding is that this is kind of an independent situation, decision for the homeowner. So usually Revision seems to be the go-to installer, and they, of course, do wonderful work. They come and do a free analysis of what your rooftop is like in terms of what you could produce, and it's a decision between the homemaker, not the homemaker, the resident and Revision in terms of what they'd like to do. So right now it's independent, but as we saw from that map, it is growing pretty steadily at the moment.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you done any studies with installation of the houses?
I do have quite a bit of data from individual houses. Actually, Ed Walcott is one of the residents here at Highland Greens. He, of course, keeps immaculate data on what he's producing, and he's got one of the larger installations here at Highland Greens. So there is some knowledge of how that stacks up in comparison. Again, in terms of what performance is actually in place, it's really dependent on the technology, the size of the system, and all these other factors. So I haven't done anything uniform across Highland Greens, but there is some promising data on individual installations. So.
Life expectancy.
Right. Because we built a solar home.
Oh, really?
And
Solar hot water.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And after 6 years, we moved.
Yes. Cost is still
You move in
there.
here in your 70s and you have a amortization rate of 10 to 20 years.
Mhm.
You're not going to get the full benefit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. That is the tricky area at the moment.
But you would, to speak to that, you would get some benefit, I would assume, in sale of your home.
Yes,
For
I
that.
assume you're able to
Yes.
sell the system once you're in a position to do that. Another interesting thing is that these payoffs, if you will, in terms of when you're starting to see the benefits, are going down as the technology improves.
Yeah.
10 years does seem to be about the number that we're approaching on. So whereas in the past it was 12, 15, 20, 25 years perhaps. A lot of this is relative to if you're taking out a loan, how that matches up to when the warranty of the solar panels are actually, because most warranties are around 12 years, I think. Some loans actually will go to that, but of course the lifespan of the panel is much longer than that. And as these things kind of improve, we are seeing the time of payoff going down. But it is a slow process, and there are still cost concerns. Yes?
I'm one of those guys who put in a 4 kilovolt system last year.
Oh, good.
And I figured that the ROI would be 6 to 7 years on electric.
Great.
And you know, the last 2 years, the cost of PV panels have been dropping precipitously.
Yes, very much so. And actually, batteries will be an interesting entrance into that discussion as that cost goes down.
Yeah.
But that's still kind of in the works in terms of wide acceptance.
It will also be interesting to see, we're putting in a new home with 45 panels here
Yes.
at Highland Green.
Yes, you
and
want the big
that's
three.
one of the reasons we're doing is we're looking at fixing the cost of that portion of our energy usage.
Yes.
Instead of looking at like what the payoff is, we know we guaranteed ourselves that cost over that next.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
it will still be generating electricity when we're dead and gone, but at least it's we know what the price of that's going to be.
Yeah.
Unlike
That's-
electrical rates, which continue to rise.
Yes, and that's another thing that goes into the value of solar that may not be accounted for in our valuation study there.
Right.
That's something that's going to evolve. I imagine there will be a new evaluation for policy purposes here in Maine. But it is interesting to see kind of these hidden areas where the payoff is actually getting lower. Or payoff time period, I should say, is getting lower.
Cameron, you mentioned Solarize Freeport. There was a lot of movement there in Freeport over the past year or so. Do you know of any examples where, say, a homeowner cooperative or a development has done something similar where they get bulk pricing, something like could be relevant for this community?
For a development, I'm not so sure. I know there have been a few implementations of sort of microgrid setups, where you kind of have a standard smaller scale either plant or on households between 1,000 or so homes, and that energy is shared among the community. I don't know if those microgrids are still tied to the larger grid, but there is some promising data on how these microgrids are set up, and actually there's a lot of discussion of how this affects the infrastructure in the United States. Should we be moving towards a panel on every home so it's very, very much distributed, or should we be kind of maximizing a given plant in terms of technology and producing for all homes in the United States? So microgrids might be an interesting area to look into there. I haven't heard of anything in particular about developments, but it's certainly possible for an area like Maine. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Cameron. Thanks, everyone.